Hey, what's up everybody? Today I'll be giving you my final thoughts on Paper Mario the Origami King. As this is the newest installment in a long-running series, I will be referencing previous titles in the series and comparing PMOC to those games, as well as giving opinions on similarities and differences that are mostly here as a point of reference and ignored in my actual rating system. I'm also doing this as Nintendo has come out stating this is a return to the way the original two games were. I'll be going into a ton of detail regarding everything in the game, including some major story spoilers. I'll be keeping the actual plot spoilers to only one section of this video, and we'll give you a heads up before going into them if you'd like to skip over that portion. This is another long one, so if you're looking for ratings on specific aspects of the game, please refer to the timestamps listed in the description. As always, I really appreciate you checking out this review and hope you will leave a comment, like, or even subscribe for more gaming content. Please stick around to the end of the video for a preview of next week's video, and without further ado, let's get into it. Paper Mario launched in 2000 on the Nintendo 64. It began a series that is now on its 6th game and was also the first Paper Mario game I played as a child. Years later, I bought Super Paper Mario for the Wii, and that became my favorite in the series. It wasn't until 2018 that I finally played the Thousand Year Door and realized that perhaps popular opinion when it comes to Paper Mario is shaped more by nostalgia than the actual quality of the titles. That being said, even though I played Thousand Year Door for the first time as an adult, I still know I will replay the game because there's something magical about the setting and the characters. I understand where a sense of nostalgia for the game can come from, even if there is nothing nostalgic about it to me. I never played Sticker Star or Color Splash, but I can tell you for a fact no one will have that similar experience with Paper Mario Origami King. The biggest reasons for that are the poor story, loose controls, weak characters, and in general, indecisiveness in what this game is trying to be. No one will remember it because it's all over the place, borrowing from everywhere it can to create a unique experience that is anything but. The first thing you notice, obviously, is the world itself. Surprisingly for a Nintendo product, the best aspects of this game are the graphics. In this regard, this game is the Nintendo equivalent of The Last of Us Part 2. Amazing graphics with mediocre gameplay that doesn't really build upon its predecessors. The art style leaves much to be desired, although I'm sure many people will appreciate the lengths to which Intelligent Systems went to create a world wholly made of paper. My problem is that it's not at all unique, and you could easily replace all the characters with characters from another universe and make a Yoshi's Island or Kirby's Epic Yarn sequel. It's cute and artsy, but it's trying too hard to create an identity for the game solely based on what the world looks like. That being said, the game is still beautiful just to look at, but unfortunately I can only give this metric a 3 out of 5 for the issues I just mentioned. It's good, but not great, and definitely far from perfect. The textures are a little overdone. The attention to detail is amazing when you see certain blocks or doors adorned with gold leaf or the so-called not bottomless holes in the environments exposing the wiring underneath. It's meticulously done, but simply renders the environments feeling fake. There's also plenty of textures that don't fit the main textures of the art style, such as dirt, fire, and ice. Anytime a cutscene occurs with one of these elements, it further breaks the already fragile artistic consistency of the game. Explosions look realistic, as if you're momentarily witnessing gameplay from a much more powerful console or a totally different game. The dirt, or earth, looks almost like a black sand beach, graphically being reminiscent of Little Big Planet textures. And the ice fits with something out of the original Paper Mario. The worst culprit when it comes to this inconsistency is the water. In cutscene water is absolutely gorgeous, and the first time I witnessed it, I was in disbelief that the Switch is capable of such realistic graphics. Once the cutscene ends, the water takes on a totally different color and texture in order to match the papery world. This was the case when I had to fill a dried up lake with water and then float down the river flowing out of it. The other issue with the textures is that they look completely different in scenes that are 100% CGI and those actually recorded within the game. There's only a handful of these, mostly at the beginning and end of the game, but the difference is night and day. I have a lot of concerns with the inconsistency of different textures, and as such, give them a 2 out of 5. They are not bad per se, but subpar for sure. What reinforces my original claim about the graphics is the lighting. I've never seen better use of lighting in any game ever. Soon as you enter a Toad's house in Toad Town, or a Vellumental temple, or even go into a basement of an office at the theme park, you instantly wish there was more to explore in that small confined space. The interior lighting creates an atmosphere that is years ahead of the Switch's outright graphic capabilities. Just check out some of these scenes from the game. There's a stark difference between how areas look outdoors versus indoors, as well as during the day and during the night. All of the nighttime areas look significantly better thanks to the increased reliance on lighting to illuminate the world. Similarly, all of the interior spaces look much better than the outdoor ones. Perhaps this was done on purpose as well, since most of the outdoor areas are more open world, and thus if you prefer the indoor areas visually, you as the player will seek out every hidden area just to experience that beauty. The lighting is amazing and definitely deserves a 5 out of 5 for going beyond all expectations. On the other hand, this could just be another example of what the game does at every possible moment, which is contradicting itself and tearing itself apart. No pun intended. This is all the more apparent the deeper you get into the actual gameplay. The controls are loose, the mechanics are atrocious, the levels and difficulty are designed with children in mind, and the overall experience feels rushed with some glitchy movement. The Thousand Year Door definitely has the most loose controls out of the Paper Mario games I've played. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as it works in that game just fine. But it doesn't feel right in this game, and definitely feels wrong overall for a Paper Mario game. For one, the jumping feels like it's 69-year-old Mario with no cartilage left in his papery little knees. Which I guess must have been the whole point, since everything and everyone in this game is made of paper. I hadn't played another Paper Mario game in about a year, and from the first jump, kept trying to hold down the A button because I was jumping about 2/3 the height I would be in the original Paper Mario games, and not even half the height Mario jumps in all of Nintendo's other titles. That, coupled with the weird folding Mario's face experiences every time he jumps, made it seem like there's a glass ceiling imposed on the entire playable area of the game. It's very frustrating, and I was unable to get used to this all the way up until the end of the game. Aside from feeling off just when moving around, it feels even worse when you're actually forced to do platforming. There are rocks, ledges, and all sorts of environmental structures that you should be able to easily jump onto, but can't. Instead, you're forced to either find a hidden block or path to reach the spot, or just jump around leaned up against an insurmountable object for a moment, like a person who also enjoys watching paint dry. Also, no pun intended. It makes the most basic controls feel bad, especially since most people who will play this are fans of Mario games in general, and will assume, as I did, that these areas should be easily reachable with the most basic jump. Speaking of basic jumps, that's all you have. There is no double jump or spin jump or anything of the sorts in the overworld. Movement overall is also an issue. There are moments when you have to make very precise movements, such as in one of the temple trials, or even when just aiming to jump from platform to platform. The movement feels stunted and imprecise. Here, when I say forward or up, I mean pointing the joystick upwards. I had plenty of moments when I was trying to move forwards and to jump from one platform to the next, and instead fell and took damage from spikes or fire, because the input is so imprecise that it oftentimes can't tell whether you are moving directly forwards or at an angle that tends to register movement more to either the left or right. When trying to move left or right, the game also can't register the movement accurately and tends to make Mario drift either forwards or backwards. Perhaps the issue is with the mapping being too precise for the Joy-Cons or Pro Controller, but this should be something that is tweaked before the release, especially in a single-player game that shouldn't require future updates to the controls. Motion controls aren't precise at all, and oddly require both Joy-Cons to be moved in unison. This goes for every single time they are used in the game. when you are fishing, when you are using the thousandfold arms ability, when you're shooting. It's a strange control scheme and just requires too much effort, but at least it can be turned off. During the final boss fight, I was actually building up a sweat from all the effort I was exerting just to get the correct motion to register as swiftly as possible, as this was a timed event. Really, the motion controls are just unnecessary and out of place, given that aside from shooting in one sequence towards the end of the game and trying to grab a panel with 1,000-fold arms, they aren't all that accurate, and the motion performed doesn't correlate to the same motion in-game. Using the hammer feels good, but also has the same aiming issues as walking. If you need to hammer something directly forwards from you, it takes 2 to 3 tries, as Mario tends to swing the hammer to either the left or right sides. It can become seriously annoying considering how prolifically Mario smashes everything with a hammer to get a result. But the easy fix is just lining up whatever you need to hit to either your left or right. Regardless, all of this contributes to the controls feeling very loose, and although not broken enough to be bad, definitely subpar for a Nintendo game, thus receiving a 2 out of 5. If the controls weren't enough of a red flag when it comes to the gameplay, the mechanics and gimmicks sure are. Abilities were introduced in the Thousand Year Door, then Super Paper Mario projected those abilities onto the pixels or partners, leaving Mario with only one ability he can do on his own, that being switching between the 2D and 3D world. PMOC attempts to harken back to that, while also doing its best to laugh in the face of every disappointed Paper Mario fan as he weeps uncontrollably at this mess. Right from the get-go, you gain the 1,000-fold arms ability. This is the only ability you have for the rest of the game. It's similar to flipping between dimensions, except that it has an extremely limited amount of uses. In fact, the areas where you can use it are clearly shown via a glowing magical circle on the ground. In the one spot you can make use of your crumpled up, jiggly freak arms. This is unjustifiable in what is basically a puzzle solving game. The battle system is also horrible. There was only one mini-boss battle that I actually really enjoyed. Despite that, once you familiarize yourself with the battle system, no battle is particularly difficult, and in fact, they don't even get harder from the first one to the last one. I'm not really sure how to explain this, but comparing my experience with that of a friend, it became obvious that while overall battles are easy, each person will struggle with a different boss battle to some degree. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that battles are basically puzzles. The fact that different minds approach the same problem differently would maybe explain it. It could also be the fact that most of the bosses don't really damage you except with their ultimate attacks, and once you figure out how to deal with them, even those aren't much of a threat. Boss battles really come down to being quick time events. Getting more specific, the new battle system requires you to rotate and slide rings, with either you being at the center and moving around enemies that are on the tiles on the rings in order to line them up for an attack boost and being able to hit them all at once, or the boss being at the center and you arranging the rings to be able to reach the boss and deal damage. The boss battles also have specific arrows, magic circles, and objects on the tiles that aid you in battle. The system wouldn't be terrible if only there was a reward for battling and if your moves actually mattered. The way it's designed, there is no incentive to battle minions because you get nothing, and it doesn't matter that you're solving a puzzle while fighting bosses because anyone could solve it with zero effort. It's a horrible gimmick that's a slap in the face of all the fans who were asking for a turn-based battle system and got literally just that. There's literally a scissor boss whose ultimate attack is just flying at you with its blades open, and you have to jump to avoid seppuku, which I wouldn't even be avoiding if I was one of the people who worked on this game and thought this was a good battle system. Paper Macho battles are amazing, but they aren't enough to change my overall opinion of the mechanics of the game. These are real-time battles with huge papier-mâché enemies, some of which actually require different approaches. Some of the papier-mâché bosses change patterns and use the tactics that require you to wait out whatever they are doing before you attack. These were awesome and I really liked them, but the flip side is that they are borrowing these encounters from Super Paper Mario. Certain regular enemies also have more interesting tactics, like boos that disappear when it's your turn to arrange them in battle, or cutout soldiers which expand and you have to fold in order to defeat all at once. These are welcome nuances to the experience, but unfortunately this is something that's totally out of the player's control, so it doesn't tilt the scale to more positively reflect on the awful aspects of the gameplay. The powers that your only real partner, Olivia, gets from you battling the mini-boss Valimentals are also very gimmicky and extremely limited in their scope of use. It's the same situation as with the Thousandfold Arms ability, but whereas you use the Arms ability at least a few times in every chapter of the game, and in boss battles, the Valimental abilities are specifically acquired to do one thing in a given section, and then aside from boss battles, used again maybe once, 2 or 3 chapters later. It would have been amazing to see them have an actual use for finding hidden areas or collectibles, or even having optional abilities you could acquire from defeating optional bosses. The partners are another horrible gimmick in this game, but mostly because they don't actually exist. I'm not saying Nintendo is guilty of false advertising with this game, but if they were this truthful with all their marketing, they could sell light bulbs to the Amish. You only team up with about 4 characters in the game, depending on whether you count Captain Toad, who helps you get a submarine during Chapter 4. Aside from that, you meet your first ally at the beginning of Chapter 2. He is no longer with you in Chapter 3. Then you meet another companion for Chapter 3, another for Chapter 5, and one more for the last chapter. Companions only being with you for one chapter is just half the problem. The other half is that you cannot control them whatsoever in battle. Each companion only has one attack, whether or not it even hits or if the partner even attacks is completely random, and your partners aren't by your side for any of the mini bosses or main bosses. They don't even go into dungeons with you. It's just pathetic what Intelligent Systems has done with the partner system. I'd keep saying how horrible it is, but there's just no point because there's nothing these partners do worth talking about. And also, I'll be trashing them some more when I talk about the characters. There are also no badges, which many fans wanted a return to. Instead, there are accessories which aid in battle. It would be an acceptable system, but there is only a total of 15 accessories divided into 4 categories. You can have 1 of 3 equipped from each of the first 3 categories and 2 of 6 equipped from the last category at any time. The problem with this is that there is really no reason to ever change accessories. Those in the first 3 categories are essentially tiered bronze, silver, or gold, and those in the last category aren't even battle specific. This is just another cop-out so that the makers could say they brought back badges without actually doing that at all. As far as items go, those have been brought back, but also in a very limited capacity, and categorized as items and weapons. The variety of items is limited, with there being POW blocks, fire and ice flowers, and a tail you can use in battle. Apart from that, you can buy stronger, degradable weapons, because that's Nintendo's newest fetish, and also why not capitalize on Breath of the Paper, am I right? It's a tragic addition to a series that was already a mess. The weapons, just like in Breath of the Wild, get completely destroyed after about 6 uses, but are relatively cheap to replace. In principle, this was an unnecessary and stupid decision, since Nintendo somehow refuses to make a proper RPG out of its only RPG title, and refuses to add the proper RPG counterpart to degradable weapons, that being crafting. In fact, you could argue the older Paper Mario games actually had crafting with recipes for food, which are nowhere to be found in PMOC either. It's a dumpster fire of game design, but I guess that's why the lighting is so amazing. There are gadgets which you can acquire from the Toad Lab in the game. These have special uses like becoming invisible or finding hidden blocks and hidden toads. I only used the Toad Finder once in the game, and that was during a part of Chapter 4 where it was necessary. I'm sure I'll use it again to finish finding all the hidden toads, so it's a nice touch. These different gadgets are really the only good additions to the mechanics of the game, but as with pretty much everything else in the game, there's a downside, and that's the fact that these gadgets have to be recharged for a fee, so basically, degradable gadgets. Aside from in-game mechanics, Nintendo is still hellbent on moving backwards in the gaming industry, and you are only allowed to have 1 save file per Switch account. This means that even if you wanted to replay the game because you're a crazy person, you'd have to delete your completed game to do it, or just make a new Switch account. But hey, I guess that's a unique gameplay experience for you. So unique in fact that this may be the only game I ever review that gets a 0 out of 5 for the game mechanics from me. The level design is pretty straightforward and split into linear and open sections. The linear sections are much more linear than in the original 3 games, but also barely involve any backtracking. In fact, the only linear area where you have to backtrack is the Temple of Shrooms in the desert. I'm actually a fan of this change, but wish it was executed better. The Temple of Shrooms is a pretty obvious ripoff of Dry Ruins from the original Paper Mario. However, Dry Ruins are a good juxtaposition to linear levels in PMOC. In Dry Ruins, you are moving forwards and backwards throughout the hallways in the ruins to proceed further. Although the backtracking would likewise occur in most other dungeon areas, there was more complexity as you had to revisit rooms to find a way forward. In PMOC, the puzzles are simpler in order to avoid backtracking, but that's just lazy level design. I would have liked to see more complexity than previous games with less backtracking. The open areas are more fun to explore, but also overstay their welcome. So it was a good choice by the design team to include both open and linear levels. If I were to rank them, overall the 4th area, Shangri Spa, is the most satisfying from a level design perspective, followed by the Scorched Sandpaper Desert and Autumn Mountain. Then I'd have to put Overlook Mountain, the Great Sea, and the Origami Castle. The Great Sea and the Origami Castle are rather uninspired, lacking any cohesive elements and any additional things to do there apart from diving for treasure in the Great Sea. They're also just not that visually appealing. The puzzles vary wildly in difficulty. There are some that are so obvious that anyone could solve them in seconds, but the game oscillates between those and puzzles you need to consult a physicist on. Overall, most are simple, but finding the solution or answer can be either blatantly obvious or so inconspicuous that it'll take you a whole day to answer a question right in Shroom City and free Luigi from a magical lamp prison. Okay, maybe it won't take you that long, but it took me that long. But I don't have any physicists in my family. Seriously though, the puzzles are all over the place and it makes you wonder even more who the target audience for this game was meant to be. The difficult puzzles make you feel accomplished when you realize how quickly you've solved them, but then the easy ones make you want to put the game down because they act as filler in an otherwise already mediocre experience. All of these things considered lead me to give the level design a 2 out of 5 for being adequate enough for the game, but also feeling too tedious at times. Moving on to the actual consistency or lack thereof in the gameplay, we come to one of the better aspects of the whole thing. Nintendo games in general are known for having very few, if any, glitches, and for the most part, that holds true here. There were plenty of moments where I was walking and couldn't jump onto a platform because I was too close to a wall or facing a wall and got clipped on it. These moments weren't a common occurrence, but they also weren't a one-off situation. This was only ever a problem when jumping close to a wall. I also ran into something I'm not sure is a glitch or a design choice. There's sequences when I was running away and was unable to jump as quickly as during regular gameplay. I'm not sure if a longer cooldown is applied during these choreographed sets to make them more tense, or if it's a glitch. If it is by design, it's horrible design, but I'm leaning more towards this being a glitch or technical issue. There seems to be a consistent frame rate drop, but only on the screen where minions run across the screen at the beginning of a battle. I'm not quite sure what causes that, but it's the only time I've experienced any frame rate drop while playing the game. Other than that, there are no game-breaking bugs or any crashes that I've experienced. So overall, the glitches are at a minimum, and there is consistency with the gameplay, deserving of a 3 out of 5. The last aspect of the gameplay that I want to cover is the difficulty. As I've mentioned from speaking with other people, this game seems to have strange difficulty spikes due to the unbalanced battles and poorly designed puzzles. There were moments where I was stuck for hours trying to figure out the simplest puzzle, then breezed through 4 mini-bosses and 2 bosses all in a day. I even completed some puzzles that I imagine would be on the more difficult side for people who aren't avid gamers in a few minutes. Earlier, when I spoke about the timed component of battles being irrelevant, I was alluding to the fact that you can buy a ton of extra time every single turn with coins. You can also throw coins every single turn, which will result in Toads throwing a heart at you and pretty much restoring you to full health. These battle mechanics make battles extremely easy once you accumulate some wealth. The problem here is that gathering coins is no problem. I ended the game with almost 100,000 coins, and that's after I started blowing through the coins for the last few major battles just to get them over with quickly and not having to worry about health. I also never used a single item in battle and never had to buy any weapons on my playthrough, so that should give you a good idea of how easy the game is. On the other hand, you can replay all the bosses in the game in Toad Town on a higher difficulty. I have yet to do this myself, but if I've learned anything from this game, it's that there's probably a steep difficulty curve with this activity. There are also challenges, which I'll be discussing later, that are pretty difficult and require a perfect playthrough of the challenge to win a trophy. Of course, the replayable bosses and challenges are all optional, so this really doesn't count towards the overall difficulty of the game. It's a rather easy game, all things considered, and because of the inconsistent difficulty spikes, I have to give the overall difficulty rating a 2 out of 5. Now let's get into the immersion of the game. I'll be talking in depth about the story and characters here, so please consider this your warning. The first metric I'd like to discuss is World's Law's Consistency, or WLC. It's a fancy name I came up with for describing how true everything in a game is to the realities of the universe within which it's set. Unlike previous Paper Mario games, this one doesn't even try to pretend that it's not just a game being played by some person. I'm not going to pretend other games don't also do that, but it's a thematic shift that's foreign to this series. There's also plenty of instances of the game trying to force a laugh that kills any logic by which the game would otherwise abide. When Mario and Olivia meet Grand Sappy in the first area and restore him, everyone in the forest breaks out into a musical number, which Olivia then memorizes after only hearing once, despite really being a child that's been alive for a few weeks and barely even being able to read. Similarly, how is it that Olivia has all this knowledge of the world that even a celebrated hero like Mario does not, and incessantly talks throughout the game, when she was literally born or folded mere days before the Origami Festival? It doesn't make any sense. There's also no explanation where she gets her magical powers from. There's also instances of the physics of the game being broken immediately after their laws are explained. For example, it's explained that once a flat paper character is folded into origami, they can never be unfolded, which is negated moments later when you start smashing origami toads with your hammer to somehow unfold them. It's also negated at the end of the game when Olivia makes a wish to unfold everyone her brother, King Ali, had folded. This particular moment in general doesn't make any sense, as it's stated out of nowhere that creating 1,000 origami cranes allows the creator to make any wish. After Ali is defeated, Olivia turns him into the 1,000th origami crane and wishes that everyone Ali had folded be unfolded. She was also folded by Ali and thus dies, but this could have easily been avoided with a caveat in the wish. Instead, on top of the already out of left field scenario, one of the main characters is pointlessly killed off, also a la Super Paper Mario. In the third chapter, you discover toads that have had their faces hole punched and are now acting like zombies, but regain their true selves once Mario defeats Hole Punch. The problem is, when Mario gets his face hole punched during the battle, he's fine. I mean, I know Mario is a guy, but come on, is his brain down in his overalls? In the same chapter, you find out that the sun in the desert had been hole punched by Hole Punch, and the desert is now in a constant state of nighttime. But while all this is happening, it's still daytime everywhere else in the world. The world itself is also a plot hole when compared to the original 3 Paper Mario games. The first game took place in the Mushroom Kingdom. The second game also took place in the Mushroom Kingdom, but Peach and Mario went on vacation to the island city of Rogueport. The third game's setting is wildly different, but it's explained away by Count Bleck teleporting Mario and friends to a different dimension. What about Peacock? This has always been the Mushroom Kingdom, but Mario has never seen any of what he's seen throughout Peacock. New additions also don't make sense and create plot holes. Like, why are there Bowser's Minion coffee shops all across the world? Are they the Starbucks of Peacock? Also, how do the minions get in them when they are all hidden behind not bottomless holes, which are basically torn out pieces of the world? How is there a game show filmed with hundreds of Shy Guys with the set located in one of the most secluded regions of the game world? There's so many questions I need answered, yet the only one I can answer is why the WLC rating for PMOG is a 1 out of 5. The characters are a little bit better, but still lacking. I would have almost considered this a positive aspect of the game, if not for the hundreds upon hundreds of toads. The only difference this time around is that the toads come in 5 or 6 colors. That being said, it's not a big improvement. They're more a plot device than actual characters. Each toad has something clever to say once you rescue him, and then runs away or goes back to whatever he was doing in his origami form. I actually thought this was cool at first, but by the end of the game, I had rescued so many toads that seeing all of them sitting on bleachers cheering me on made me realize how little effort went into their characterization. It looks like an artist that just ran out of color, painting a Picasso. This is not something that should come from a first-party studio. Their dialogue makes it even worse because out of the hundreds of toads you rescue, each one is either funny, sarcastic, angry, or one of like 2 other emotions. There's nothing unique about any of them, and they are all named Toad. The actual characters that become your allies, on the other hand, are much more interesting, but not necessarily unique or even affable. Bobby, your first partner... Wait, never mind. I refuse to call them partners. Ally. Doesn't really have much of a personality. He's just scared of everything and keeps getting in trouble, like falling off of a bridge or getting lost in tall grass. He even takes you on a quest after the 2nd chapter to help find his friend's fuse so that he could use it to sacrifice himself and save Olivia from getting crushed by a boulder. Unfortunately, this sort of comes out of nowhere as well, only being foreshadowed right after Olivia gets stuck under the boulder. There is no character development for Bobby. He just goes from being there with you to sacrificing himself to save his friend. Similarly, your next ally, Professor Toad, is also a coward and doesn't really have any unique traits. He has some fun dialogue but no character development, and once you leave the desert, he stays there until you return. While sailing the Great Sea, you travel with Captain Toad, who is given a little character through some backstories for him, but you don't really interact with him and he's not even an ally. In the next chapter, you help Bowser Jr. and Kamek rescue Bowser, which is actually probably the best chapter in the game. Kamek actually has a lot of character, is snarky, but also sort of downtrodden by Bowser and Bowser Jr. The problem is, this character doesn't grow whatsoever either, and neither does Bowser Jr. Bowser accompanies you in the final chapter, but it's hard to see any character growth as he seems rather kinder than normal from the start, and then falls to presumably his death in the final battle. Olivia is the only character who shows real growth, but it's through her actions rather than words, and maybe it's because she was allowed to be a true partner character for the entire journey. That is, until she inexplicably kills herself at the end of the game. A few of the other characters found in the world are also unique, like a DJing Toad or some of the Shogun Studios and Toad Town residents. But these aren't characters unique for their looks or personality, or really anything to do outside of their profession in the game. As such, there was a lot done here to improve on the complaints from Color Splash, but unfortunately it's subpar to what could have been, and thus the characters earn a 2 out of 5. The story, writing, and pacing of the game is on a similar level to the characters. The writing is a bipolar beast. Longer dialogue is horribly boring, while the one-liners from Toads You Save are amazing. On the other hand, the constant Toad references and jokes are insulting. It's like they know they made terrible games with Sticker Star and Color Splash, and instead of acknowledging it and acknowledging what the fans want, they think they'll find comic relief by joking about all the toads in the game. If the team behind PMOC put as much time into the rest of the game as they did into hand-holding soliloquies, this would be a masterpiece. As far as the monologues go though, Olivia is constantly nagging you with pointless, frivolous, and idiotic text that is completely unnecessary. The game will have her explain to you exactly what you see happening in-game, but when you ask her for a hint because you're stuck on a puzzle, she can't utter a single useful phrase. Anyways, now I'm going to talk about what I was just saying about her nagging you all the time, because funny enough, it seems like at this point in the video I was going to be talking about this, so I'm just going to go ahead and start, unless of course there's something I should be doing instead of talking about what I was going to talk about, and of course about all the things that are going on in the video right now, as you can clearly see me fighting something. You get the point. It's annoying and it assumes the player spent a year of his life banging his head against the wall. The dialogue also cannot be sped up, which makes me want to bang my head against the wall. The story itself is the weakest out of the 4 Paper Mario games I've played. Even as far as any story-driven game goes, this one is a little weak. There are plenty of plot holes right from the get-go, like why Mario wasn't folded up right at the beginning along with all of Bowser's minions. It isn't until halfway through the 4th chapter that you are told where Olivia, Ollie, and the Legion of Stationery came from. The Legion of Stationery, of course, being the art supplies you fight as bosses, and Ollie being the main villain of the game, Olivia's brother. It also makes for some awful pacing because up until that point in the game, you know nothing about anyone's motivations. The ending is also poor, and I'd even go as far as to say cruel. It makes a joke of Ollie, who to be fair was very evil, but also doesn't really explain why he did all the things he did. I mean, an explanation is provided, but it's very weak and feels rather rushed. There are no backstories for the Vellementals, which are the elemental monsters that act as mini-bosses that give Olivia her elemental powers. It would also be unfair to say that the old Paper Mario games explained any weird aspects of the world, but it made sense unlike here. It made sense that there could be a long-forgotten shrine in the Ice Palace dedicated to Merlovely's ancestors because any mystics could have had a shrine dedicated to them. It made sense that Piantas could run an organized crime outfit out of Rogueport because any criminals in Rogueport could. It made sense that someone could lock Piccolo in a treasure chest inside of a house in Flipside because all the pixels were locked away, awaiting Mario to come for them. It doesn't make any sense why Ollie turned a bunch of elemental creatures, only one of which was worshipped or even known of by anyone, into origami monsters hellbent on destruction. Most of the environments in the game are respectable. They are visually appealing and have just enough going on in certain areas to draw your attention. The only real downside when it comes to the environments is that some are rather empty. This becomes especially true once you complete all the not bottomless holes in an open environment and realize that there isn't really anything else going on there in terms of gameplay and visuals. Some environments also completely change depending on where you are in the story, and sometimes it's for the better, sometimes for the worse. The desert area, for example, is gorgeous at night. However, once you complete that chapter, it's in a constant state of day and looks completely different. It's not nearly as compelling and becomes so bland that I didn't want to spend any more time there. The opposite is true for Shangri-Spa, a section which is covered with clouds before you defeat the lightning-wielding mini-boss, and the whole area clears up and fits in well with the rest of the majestic Shangri-Spa environment. Visuals aside though, each environment is pretty unique and true to itself. Despite a lack of enemy variety, you can expect to fight piranha plants in the jungle area on Shangri-Spa, but not in the desert, for example, or Cheep Cheeps in the Great Sea, but not on top of Overlook Mountain. There's only one place where the environment feels out of place, and that's when you discover Captain Toad. But even then, in retrospect, the design decisions that went into that environment are justified by the story of why Captain Toad was there in the first place. There's enough consistency within terms of archetypes that each region feels unique, even if the paper gimmick overall makes worlds stand out less from one another. The environments aren't great, but they are good enough to keep you looking forward to the next one, even once the story gets old, thus deserving a 3 out of 5. Music has been a strong point for the series since its inception. Unfortunately, it takes a slight hit in this one for me. Although most of the tracks are great, not all fit with the area in which they are used. A lot of them borrow from Super Paper Mario, and the overall diversity of sounds just doesn't fit well together. There are areas where the music playing doesn't acoustically match what's going on in the game thematically. The desert level, which is the second best level in the game for me, is a big culprit of this one. You start the level having to make your way through a canyon into some mines. The canyon area has a tune that sounds like public domain music used in most cowboy westerns. There's nothing else about the area that gives off the impression that you're in the Wild West. No other track is similar to this one, and once you move through the extremely short canyon, you never revisit the area, and none of the musically implied themes are ever explored either. In the very next section of the mines, the music is very somber due to Olivia finding out Bobby sacrificed himself for her, and it worked extremely well with the overall dark and isolated setting of these caves where only Monty Moles live. However, as soon as you speak to Olivia for the first time in the caves, the music shifts inexplicably into this hard rock track that is totally out of place and ruins the moment of grief the game just tried to impose on you a few seconds earlier. Later in that chapter, you visit Shroom City, which has been taken over by Sniffits, who now call it Sniff City. The music matches the desert setting and has a Middle East meets Vegas vibe to it that fits perfectly. That is, until you enter the hotel and walk into a pool party where the DJ is blasting a song that actually has some humming and vocals, but is a total shift away from what you've been immersed in for the entire time you've been exploring the city. Later, you're exploring the Temple of Shrooms, and it's presented as a kid-friendly horror section. The music matches the setting until you have to take a stereo radio and have the zombified toads hear the music, start dancing to it, and follow you back to the room where you end up fighting Hole Punch. It's a funny mission, but the whole thing comes out of nowhere and you go from listening to creepy tune music to a disco tune. It all feels inconsistent, and like the team said, let's throw in everything we got so people think we put in effort. A further lack of effort is apparent when you realize that some of the songs are in essence remakes of Super Paper Mario songs. This was extremely apparent to me with one of the Autumn Mountain tracks, which sounded like the Summer Guy theme, as well as the music that plays when you start exploring the Great Sea beyond the fog. Those tracks are MIDI tracks, which harkens back to how the entire SPM soundtrack was created, but beyond that, the melodies sound exactly like certain SPM songs. There would be a chance that this is coincidental if this wasn't the same company responsible for that game. There's no doubt in my mind they just decided to reuse music because it was easier. Furthermore, that's only 2 or 3 tracks that I'm convinced are directly taken from their previous work. But if that's really the case, there's probably also other tracks taken from other Mario games that flew over my head. Some tracks are also clearly public domain, like during the Rubber Band boss fight in Shogun Studios at the end of Autumn Mountain Chapter. Here, they used Russian orchestral pieces that are well known and often used in ballet, which is funny considering that I'm trying to include as little music as possible from the game so that I don't get a channel strike from good old Nintendo don't. The music is just all over the place, with there being public domain music, MIDI created music, tracks taken from previous games, orchestral pieces, piano solos, hard rock riffs, a handful of show tunes, disco tracks, and so on and so forth. The only consistent thing about the soundtrack is that there's so much diversity you're bound to find at least 1 or 2 songs you enjoy. Aside from the areas I mentioned, the music is generally well matched to the gameplay and the environments. All these complaints are more stemming from the momentary break in immersion that occurs within many levels, rather than entire sections with just horrible music. And for that matter, there really isn't any bad music in the game per se, but there are definitely tracks that are much stronger than others. That said, the music is a solid 3 out of 5, not being the greatest in any regard, not even being the greatest Paper Mario soundtrack, but holding its own, and it only faltering when an immersion-breaking track is forced into a scene for either comic relief or for no deducible reason. Moving on to the value of the game, there's a lot of good and a lot of bad. This game has no replayability unless you are a YouTuber trying to create how-to videos on completing all of the challenges and finding all the collectibles in this game. I guess there's some replayability for me after all. Really though, even Nintendo is advising you against replaying the game with their single save policy. If the company that made it is telling you not to go back and restart it, then that's probably one of the few things they are doing right. The game likely won't hold any nostalgic value either for any children that are just now getting into this series with the installment. It's a quirky game with lots to do but little character and no reward for restarting the game. It's pretty ironic that this metric is only saved by the length of the game but also destroyed by it. Or maybe it's just because I'm grouping replayability and length together. The game takes roughly 20 to 25 hours to complete, and that's with discovering about 70% of all the toads and at least half of the other collectibles. That time is for a first playthrough, without using any help for puzzles. So it's definitely on the shorter side overall, but about on par for a AAA title. The problem is that the longer the game is, the less incentive you have to replay it, as you'd have to delete your save to do so. There's no New Game Plus. The fact that there is no branching narrative, no choice making, nothing you can do that would lock you out of any lore or collectibles, nothing at all that would result in you having a different experience upon multiple playthroughs, kills the appeal of this game for me. The whole situation just shows you how far out of touch with reality Nintendo is, and I have to give this metric a 2 out of 5 for being subpar while providing enough content to make the length acceptable. Speaking of which, there's a ton of collectibles. There's 120 miniature models of characters and objects from the game classified as treasure, as well as a couple hundred toads to find, hidden and turned into origami. It's nice to have a return to collectibles in Paper Mario, but unfortunately, instead of drawing from its predecessors, also no pun intended, it takes a page out of I promise that was the last one. It takes a page out of Super Mario Odyssey and Animal Crossing. Many of the collectibles can simply be bought with coins, making actual effort required for less than the full 120. The number of toads is also inflated by the fact that sometimes you'll find up to 8 toads in the same exact spot, and on top of that, there isn't any real puzzle solving involved in finding toads beyond smashing things with your hammer. If you were really lazy, you could just run around the world smashing everything with your hammer, and eventually you'd find at least half the toads. The only reward for finding toads is that they can help in battle if you pay them. But after Overlook Mountain, the first area, finding more toads won't affect battles in any way. You can also buy art at the museum by spending toad points, which you receive for finding toads. I would also consider filling in the not bottomless holes as collectibles in the game. It counts towards unlocking music tracks in the museum, unlocks a few paths that are necessary to progress in the game, and also makes the world look complete when you fill all of them in and suddenly the environment isn't riddled with holes anymore. There are also a lot of hidden blocks that you can find, although I am also not certain of the exact number. These will occasionally create a platform from which you can jump onto a higher platform and reach a treasure or other hidden toad. So all of these collectibles are intertwined. It's not a bad system, in fact I like it, and what makes it even better is that you can track your progress with each of these individual collectibles on the map screen that shows you a percentage for your completion rate of each collectible within a level. I would go as far as to say that the amount of collectibles and the way everything in regards to them is executed is great, except for the inflated numbers. The fact that in later levels there are almost no collectibles and no toads to find, and just the overall lack of difficulty in finding the collectibles. Aside from a few trickier ones, all are relatively easy, and even for the trickier ones, you have the option of using one of the Sensor Lab tools, like the Toad Radar or Hidden Block Hider, or an accessory to give you obvious hints for where these collectibles are located. Comparatively speaking, it's easier to find all these collectibles than it was to collect all the capture cards, recipes, and other objects in Super Paper Mario. So even though I'm not holding that against this game, I still can't give it more than a 3 out of 5 for the collectibles. The challenges and minigames are a little bit lacking, especially for a puzzle game, but the ones that are here are great. There are 15 challenges you can complete to receive trophies. Most of those are very tough. I only have the Coin Captain challenge for completing the Eddy River Falls and gathering all the coins in that section. It took me something like 40 minutes to complete the perfect run. There's other similar challenges like that, but there's also trophies for finding all the hidden blocks, all the toads, things of that nature. There's also a trophy for collecting a total of 300,000 coins, to name another. Like I said, there's only 15, but it's plenty to keep you busy for hours beyond the actual story of the game. Some of the mini games include whitewater rafting on the Eddy River Falls, a shuriken throwing mini game in the Shogun Studios, going through one of the ninja houses and trying to find all the hidden ninja toads in there. I'd even consider sailing the Great Sea and diving to find treasure as a minigame. Overall, there's plenty of variety with no two minigames being similar, but there also isn't a lot of them to begin with. There's only a few more in the dojo back in Toad Town and the Shy Guys finished last game show in Shangri-Spa. The main battle-oriented minigame at the dojo lets you replay bosses on a higher difficulty. I haven't even tried that one yet, as I'm just not that interested in it, unfortunately. All in all, there's not a ton in the way of mini-games and challenges, but what is here is exceptionally well done and difficult, thus I'll give it a 3 out of 5. I had the same issue with the extras in the game. What's here is well executed, but there's just not much here. The only extras that are a nice touch would be most of the collections at the museum. It's a nice touch that you can unlock so much artwork, all of the music tracks, trophies, and even a database for all the enemies and toads you've found. It fits well into the museum building, but still could have been better thought out. A compendium would have served much better for the enemy and toad database than having to revisit the museum every time you wanted to check on that. It also doesn't really make sense why all the music tracks are only playable inside the museum. Is Nintendo really expecting people to walk into the sound collection room and just stand there for hours listening to music they've already unlocked, unable to do anything else because it stops playing as soon as you leave the room? Or am I just too attached to the older Paper Mario games to realize how unique of an experience this is? You can also play the DJ Toad's music in the hotel pool area, but once again I fail to see how that's anything more than a meaningless addition to the game. The addition of a boot car for the desert and the ability to have Professor Toad dig for treasure in that area are both nice touches that have some use. The boot car makes travel quicker, and aside from finding collectibles, the professor can also just dig up coins for you, even if you'll never need them because the game throws money at you like a polecat patron. Park benches have replaced toad houses to allow you to replenish health. I hate the change as it adds nothing to the game and all of the park bench locations feel super random and unnecessary anyways, since the difficulty is so low and you're constantly having hearts thrown at you whenever you're in a slightly more difficult situation. Your HP can also be increased to a maximum upwards of 200. I haven't found all of the hearts yet, but I think it can go up to about 250. It's nice that that's a thing, but because they can be found in the overworld as well as in dungeons, it's just another way this game borrows from the Zelda series. All of this is alright, but with most of what I just mentioned, you feel like this should be expected from any high quality game, and well executed. Not rewarded just for barely being there. 2 out of 5. Finally, I need to address the most biased portion of my review, the Intangibles. Everything I've said until this point was of course explained from my perspective and my unique experience, but there was reasoning behind how I arrived at the conclusion I arrived at. For this next part is just how I felt in the moments that I could not explain. The moments that made me smile were lacking. It wasn't so bad that I didn't enjoy playing the game at all, but there was only one moment I can recall where I felt my blood rush and really enjoyed playing and got excited about it. That was during my battle with the Water of Elemental. It defeated me the first time, and the second time I faced it, I was ready and pumped when I finally had it on the run. I was expecting to experience this again with at least one of the other two Vellumentals following it, or at least one other boss, but that was never the case. Part of it might be that this was the point where I felt I finally figured out and was comfortable with the battle system, but a part of it is that although what the bosses do changes, the pattern for how to deal with them does not. It's the same thing over and over, where you attack, get a magic circle turned on to critically injure the boss, then use another circle to avoid his attack, and repeat until you defeat him. There were no satisfying or unexpected plot twists. No difficult battles, nothing to get you excited about the story. Halfway through, I feel like I was rushing just to finish the game and be done with it. The comical moments are great, and they definitely put a smile on my face, but somehow, in a self-contradicting way, I was both tired of and longing for more of those moments as the game progressed. This is probably because the humor grew stale, and some of the Toad jokes began to just feel worn out. But at the same time, towards the later levels, you come across less and less Toads that need saving, and thus less and less funny dialogue. It's almost as if the game itself decided it's time to wrap things up at this point and just move on. It's not all awful, but most of it sure is if we're looking for something to keep you excited about the game. So I have to give this a 1 out of 5. A ton of frustrating moments occurred for me as well. Some were just the game not being well designed, but a lot were also attributed to some of the things I spoke about in the previous section. The fact that at a certain point I just wanted to be done already made the game more frustrating when I was failing at a battle, or had to do a platforming section 15 times over because the controls just weren't precise enough and I kept failing. The plot was frustrating, especially with the poor pacing and just lack of anything that would make you feel like you're growing alongside the characters. There was nothing that kept me interested, invested, or even sympathetic to my allies because they were all a bunch of naive, incompetent morons that used comic relief to not have to tell you anything about themselves. There was a section in the desert where you have a chance to answer some questions, and if you're wrong, you get trapped in a magic lamp for all eternity and die. It feels super out of place and extremely dark. It makes no sense, just like half of this game, and you can't even figure out whether it's intended for children or adults. Some of the humor is very adult, but then the gameplay and most of the puzzles are designed for a younger audience. I was joking about seppuku earlier, but literally when the scissors cut you, if you miss dodging them, the screen goes red and you just see a black outline of Mario getting cut in half like something out of a Quentin Tarantino movie. Even when Bobby blows up, it's replayed in slow motion 3 times from different angles for dramatic effect. The sheer amount of times characters acknowledge that they are made of paper and all the cruel things that happen to paper in the game makes you feel disgusted when you actually think about what would be going on if we were to say this is all happening to actual living beings. Even the idea that Ali folded Olivia and gave her life with the fold of life is somewhat incestual. None of these things seem appropriate for younger players, and yet the game also loves to baby you and walk you through, well, walking. It's just also self-contradicting and frustratingly annoying. The only saving grace in this regard is that most of the game was enjoyable despite all of the frustrating moments, and so I'll give this metric at least a 1 out of 5. It's difficult to sum up everything this game has to offer. I could start with the most amazing details, and before I finish a single thought, I'd realize how all those amazing aspects are marred by countless shortcomings. Aspects of the graphics are contradictory. The world is beautiful, but everything looks the same because the paper gimmick is the theme, so it doesn't matter what colors or objects or enemies you encounter in different regions. Level design is all over the place. It's acceptable, but the sewer level is pathetically short and not at all acceptable for a Mario game, and that goes for other linear levels as well. Even something as simple as consistency with enemy strength varies. If you are strong enough, you can defeat an enemy in the overworld. That is, until you encounter that same exact enemy in a later chapter, and somehow it's stronger despite having the same exact stats. The controls add mechanics no one wanted, but then can't even perfect those. The battle system is abysmal even beyond what I've said before, as you can't go back to a previous ring if you've missed it. You have to keep moving till you come to it again. You can't select an attack and then select the target. You have to select the target first. You can't even select whether or not to use a Velelemental power if you step on an active magic circle in battle. The boot car and boat are amazing touches, but have awkward control schemes when moving in them. You get confetti bag upgrades that make no difference because later holes require more confetti, and so you're using it up at the same rate throughout the entire game. Then on the other hand, you have timing for attacks in battle, which increases power like it used to in the older titles. You also can hit a character with your hammer, increase the character temporarily, which is such a detailed touch and contradicts how little effort went into more important areas of the controls. The story is lacking, with decent enough characters but a poor plot and a ridiculous amount of plot holes, and I'm not talking about the not bottomless ones. These characters live in a world made of paper, but don't know what basic art supplies are. The art supplies that become animated have a creation story and that's it. You don't meet them until you fight them, and although they have personality, you can't even begin to care for them because you meet them, defeat them, and never mention them again. There's cutscenes with Olivia that you can skip, which is great, but then there's other cutscenes you have to rewatch over and over, like with each Toad Tower rotating in the desert. There's a lot of value for your money, but collectibles and extras are marred by their own shortcomings and borrow so heavily from other Nintendo franchises that this game loses its own identity even further. That's actually being too kind. This game doesn't have its own identity to begin with. It's all over the place with SPM-style real-time battles and turn-based battles reminiscent of nothing in the series and appreciated by no one. Artistically, it tries to make each region as unique as possible, but refuses to move away from having everything made out of paper as an overarching theme that limits the game visually. It's as if the makers wanted to put in as much of everything they could think of as possible without listening at all to what the fans wanted, and without even caring to fine-tune all the random elements taken from the games PMOC steals from. It's enjoyable enough to play through and never return to again. It's not a game worth $60, and if I wasn't reviewing it, I would have never bought it. If you really want to experience this for yourself, I recommend waiting about a decade until you can find this game used on eBay for $10. You have the right to do whatever you want, but supporting this series any further as a fan is the same as folding over for Nintendo and letting them have their way with you. My final score for this sometimes pleasant, but usually frustrating and bipolar mess, 4.3 out of 10. Despite how lowly I think of this game, I did already buy it, even though I can't play as Luigi, but that's besides the point. I'm a completionist. So to change pace, for next week's video, I'll be doing a guide on the trophies in the game, while I ramble on about some of the other things I didn't touch on in the review. Either that or I might just buy myself Bug Fables. Either way, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you tune in again next week. Peace, baby!